Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing the entire system that holds your country together doesn't really exist. No strong government. No real president. No power to collect taxes. No authority to enforce laws. Just a fragile agreement held together by hope, fear, and unfinished promises. That was the United States in the year 1787. The Revolutionary War was over. Independence had been won. But the nation itself was quietly falling apart, and most people didn't even realize how close everything was to collapse. When Americans talk about the birth of their country, they usually imagine heroic battles, bold declarations, and fiery speeches about freedom. But the real moment that decided whether the United States would survive didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened behind closed doors, in a stuffy room in Philadelphia, where a group of exhausted, suspicious, and deeply divided men gathered to attempt something that had never been done before. They were about to design a new kind of government, without kings, without emperors, and without precedent. And if they failed, the American experiment might have ended before it truly began. After independence, the United States was operating under a document called the Articles of Confederation. On paper, it sounded noble. The states would remain mostly independent, and the national government would be weak, so it could never become tyrannical like the British Crown. But in practice, the system was broken. Congress couldn't collect taxes. It couldn't regulate trade. It couldn't enforce its own laws. States printed their own money, argued with one another, and acted like separate countries instead of one nation. Foreign powers watched closely, waiting for the experiment to fail. By the mid-1780s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Soldiers who had fought in the Revolution weren't being paid. Farmers were drowning in debt. Inflation was spiraling. Then came Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, when angry farmers, many of them war veterans, took up arms against their own state government. To leaders like George Washington, this was a terrifying sign. If Americans were already rebelling against each other, what would happen next? Something had to change. So in May of 1787, delegates from 12 states, every state except Rhode Island, arrived in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, many of them knew revisions wouldn't be enough. The entire system needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The doors were shut. The windows were closed, even in the summer heat. Guards stood watch outside. What was said inside those walls was meant to stay there. These men understood the danger of what they were doing. If the public learned how divided they were, or how radical their ideas might be, the entire effort could collapse before it even had a chance. George Washington was chosen to preside over the convention. His presence alone gave the meeting legitimacy. He rarely spoke, but when he did, everyone listened. James Madison, quiet and relentless, arrived more prepared than anyone else. He had studied ancient republics, modern governments, and political theory obsessively. He believed the survival of the nation depended on creating a strong but limited federal government. Almost immediately, conflict erupted. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states feared being swallowed and demanded equal representation. Some delegates wanted a powerful national government. Others feared replacing one tyranny with another. There were arguments over executive power, judicial authority, taxation, trade, and even whether ordinary citizens could be trusted at all. At times, the convention seemed on the verge of failure. One of the most heated debates was over representation in Congress. The Virginia Plan proposed a bicameral legislature where representation was based on population. Small states pushed back hard with the New Jersey Plan, which gave each state equal votes. The tension grew so intense that delegates openly threatened to walk out. The breakthrough came with what would later be called the Great Compromise. Congress would have two chambers. The House of Representatives would be based on population. The Senate would give each state equal representation. No one was fully satisfied, which was exactly why it worked. But compromise came with moral costs. Slavery cast a dark shadow over the convention. Southern states wanted enslaved people counted toward population for representation, but not counted for taxation. Northern states objected. The result was the infamous 3/5 compromise, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for both representation and taxes. It was a political solution that avoided immediate collapse, but it baked injustice directly into the nation's foundation. There were also debates over the presidency. Some feared a king in disguise. Others feared a weak executive that would leave the nation paralyzed. Should the president be elected by Congress? By the people? For life? For a short term? The final design reflected deep anxiety and careful balance. A single president, elected indirectly through the Electoral College, limited to 4-year terms, with powers strong enough to lead but restrained enough to prevent tyranny. Then there was the judiciary. There was no model for a national court system like the one they imagined. Still, the delegates agreed that laws meant nothing without courts to interpret and enforce them. The Supreme Court was born from that realization, though much of its power would only become clear years later. As summer turned into fall, the delegates were exhausted. Many doubted the document would ever be accepted. When the final draft was ready, not everyone signed it. Some refused on principle. Others feared the lack of explicit protections for individual rights. On September 17, 1787, the Constitution was signed. But that was only the beginning. The document meant nothing unless the states ratified it. And ratification sparked one of the fiercest public debates in American history. Supporters, known as Federalists, argued that the Constitution was necessary for survival. Opponents, the Anti-Federalists, warned it gave too much power to the central government and threatened liberty. Newspapers exploded with essays and attacks. Town halls filled with angry voices. The future of the country hung in the balance. To persuade the public, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of essays now known as the Federalist Papers. They explained, defended, and promoted the Constitution with clarity and urgency. Their arguments didn't just shape ratification, they shaped how Americans would understand their government forever. One of the biggest turning points came when Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights. This assurance helped tip the scales. State by state, the Constitution was ratified. In 1788, it became the law of the land. The federal government officially came to life in 1789. What the delegates created was not perfect. They knew that. In fact, they expected future generations to revise and amend it. What made the Constitution revolutionary wasn't that it solved every problem, but that it created a flexible framework capable of surviving change, conflict, and growth. It balanced power between states and the federal government. Between branches of government. Between liberty and authority. It assumed humans were flawed and designed a system to contain those flaws. More than 2 centuries later, the Constitution still shapes daily life in ways most people never think about. Every election, every court case, every debate over rights and power traces back to that summer in Philadelphia. The men of 1787 didn't know if their experiment would last 10 years or 1,000. They only knew that doing nothing meant failure. So they argued. They compromised. They risked everything.